The earliest humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in small tribes and would move from place to place to follow the food supply. Certain areas known as fertile crescents existed on the banks of large rivers and deltas that were so plentiful in food, humans were able to establish permanent settlements. Once humans were able to live in the same area for multiple seasons, they were able to discover agriculture by witnessing the process of seeds falling from plants, the germination and sprouting of the seeds, and the eventual growth of a new plant. Once the tribes began to participate in agriculture, a surplus of food occurred, and for the first time, some tribal members began to specialize in tasks other than acquiring food. This specialization brought on greater needs for language and writing and caused tribes to form their own cultures to help them answer the questions of how and why they existed. Another consequence of this new sedentary lifestyle was the discovery of metals, initially gold because of its shiny nature. The first deposits of gold harvested were in present-day Turkey, where they were found in abundance in the forms of nuggets in shallow rivers. These nuggets were not pure gold, but mostly electrum, which is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. Because of the isolation between tribes, the cultures that formed were unique amongst them and often were very central to the tribe's purpose and intertwined religion, work, and social hierarchy. In this definition, cultures were based not only on the language of the tribe, but also their specific knowledge on how to make tools and how they pass this down to future generations. The earliest uses of gold were to be used as ornaments signifying one's wealth, either as jewelry worn while alive or included as burial gifts to help one out in the afterlife. The oldest example of a culture putting an emphasis on gold is from the Varna culture, based around the present city of Varna in Bulgaria. Varna culture began in 4600 BC and saw its people put an emphasis on the importance of preparing oneself for the second life. The people of Varna constructed a large underground acropolis with tombs filled with gold artifacts, with this spectacular find only being discovered in 1972 by accident. Varna and its many sister cultures along the Black Sea flourished until their eventual downfall as part of the Bronze Age collapse, an event that remains a mystery among historians. Before the collapse, the Hittite Empire controlled most of Anatolia, which, along with Egypt, were the main gold-producing areas in the world at the time, but then fractured again into smaller tribes with their own cultures as the more powerful Assyrian Empire stepped in. Founded in 1200 BC, Phrygia was one of the more powerful successor tribes in Anatolia, and they began to retake control of the gold mining and trade between Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. Under the famed King Midas, gold was said to be so plentiful in Phrygia that anything Midas touched turned to gold. By 695 BC, another former Hittite tribe based around the city of Lydia ascended and replaced Phrygia as the preeminent power in Anatolia with help from the Assyrians. Like many early cultures, the Lydians needed to protect their farms and mines, and thus led the dominant government system to switch from a tribal council to one of a monarchy, where the strongest and wealthiest member would be crowned king and then have the duty of protecting the people of the kingdom by raising an army and building fortifications. Soldiers would be professionally trained and worked for the king and required a steady supply of food, armor, and weapons. Because these soldiers did not have the time to grow their own food, the kingdom began to take a portion of their subjects' harvest as a tax in exchange for the protection offered to them. This form of taxation, where the king directly collects physical resources, ideally equally amongst the subjects, was very inefficient and difficult to execute. The king of Lydia came up with a solution in where they would produce coins from their abundant silver and gold mines that would serve a token representation of the real value of a commodity. A commodity simply is a raw resource that has the same value no matter where it is extracted. While gold and silver are commodities themselves, their rarity allowed them to be prime candidates for materials to make coins. The kingdom would first start by stamping the mined gold into pre-weighted coins with a royal insignia indicating to the user that the coin was in fact real gold and did not need to be reweighed. The king then distributed an initial supply of coins to the public and established a central marketplace within the kingdom where the subjects could bring their goods and exchange them for the coins now circulating within the system. Gold has a natural power over humans due to its color and shininess, and is most certainly not just a European phenomenon. The pre-Columbian civilizations in Central and South America had immense amounts of gold that to them was believed to be leftover poop from the gods during their time on Earth, and used it extensively as a decorative ornament. When the first coins were minted and given to the masses, it changed the wiring in our brains and started an obsession with the acquisition of gold and other shiny objects. Although gold is a commodity just like wheat, its perceived value became much higher than the value you would get if you melted it down into raw gold, due to its ubiquitous nature to be able to be used as a medium to acquire any good one needs or desires. So now people had the incentive to produce goods needed by others to obtain more coins. Although the kingdom of Lydia fell to Cyrus the Great in the Achaemenid Persian Empire in 546 BC, the practice of coinage and taxation reverberated out and continued permanently in the known world around the Mediterranean. While gold created the strongest reaction for humans, silver was actually more commonly used as money because there simply was not enough gold to make the number of coins needed to facilitate commerce. Following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the victorious Germanic tribes reestablished monarchies on the continent of Europe and developed the feudal system as a way to assert control over the vast areas that Rome once ruled. In the feudal system, the king would now delegate some of his responsibilities to dukes, who were landowners outside the kingdom proper, allowing the reach of the kingdom to expand. In exchange for the right to own land, the dukes would pay a land tax to the king, which became the primary use of gold coins, something far too expensive for the average peasant to hold. In the year 647, the Rashidun Caliphate began to spread into North Africa. Not only did the conquering Muslims bring and spread the religion of Islam to the area, but also introduced the camel as a pack animal. The camel was useful when crossing deserts and allowed West African tribes to cross the Sahara to trade with the Muslims. This opportunity allowed the formation of the Ghana Empire, who began the trans-Saharan trade route and traded gold, salt, and slaves in a triangle trade within the empire as well as with the outside Muslim world. The Ghana Empire eventually fell to the nearby Mali Empire in 1230 due to the Malians greatly outnumbering Ghana. Unlike Ghana, the Mali Empire officially adopted Islam and greatly expanded foreign trade efforts, making the empire incredibly wealthy and necessitating the founding of a major commercial hub such as Timbuktu. The most famous ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa's reign began in 1312. In 1324, Mansa Musa participated in Hajj by making the journey to Mecca, bringing along with him a large entourage to carry ungodly amounts of gold. During the journey, he stopped in Egypt and gave away huge amounts of gold to average Egyptians on the street as an extreme act of generosity. This sudden influx of gold caused a crash in gold prices in Egypt and destroyed the economy at the time with rapid increases in inflation. A decrease in demand for gold across the Muslim world caused the power of Mali to wane and allowed the nearby Songhai people to conquer them and establish their own empire in 1464. It was during this time that gold and silver reserves in Europe were running out and the kingdoms were scrambling to find a new source. The Portuguese were the first to arrive on the coast of West Africa in 1482 and began trading for gold with the Songhai, rescuing them from a lack of demand of gold in the Muslim world. Also, during this time, the power and influence of city-state republics on the Italian peninsula was growing as they established wide-reaching trade networks. The republican form of government for the city-states, most famously Florence, was allowed to flourish due to the same geographical reasons that the Roman and Greek republics were able to form years before. Coastal mountain ranges and ocean access protected the city-state from would-be invaders while allowing them to exert trade and military power over the water. In absence of a king, wealthy individuals exerted power and influence within the city-states, with the Medici family effectively running Florence. The Medicis gained prominence by founding one of the first banks and started the belief of mercantilism, which is where a country's power is based on how much gold or silver it has in reserve. Now, these metals were not merely a medium to facilitate taxation for the kingdoms, but also as a way to increase their money and power amongst other nations. The Portuguese were the first to centralize power and build up fleets of boats to explore Africa and Asia. The Spanish were quick to follow, choosing to instead sail west in hopes of finding a quick route to Asia and accidentally discovering the Americas in the process. Gold and silver were so abundant in America that it began to make West Africa less important and saw the decline of the Songhai until they were invaded and overthrown by the Sultanate of Morocco in 1591. The Spanish conducted widespread mining of gold and silver and shipped it back to Europe, flooding the market and causing a major crash in the value of these metals. Additionally, as the rest of Western Europe began to modernize and industrialize, Spain made none of these investments in industry and relied on buying and importing these goods in exchange for gold. Although they were wealthy, the Spanish had no industrial power and thus lost influence and were eventually subjugated by the rising French and English empires. One consequence of the flood of gold into the European market was that silver no longer had to be standard metal of choice for coins. In 1717, Britain fixed the price of one gold guinea coin to that of 21 silver shillings. This ratio was off balance and overvalued the price of gold relative to silver and caused the rest of Europe to switch over to a gold standard, where that all their money was tied back to the amount of gold they possessed. In imperial China, gold was not common and silver was the preferred metal value to be used as money. This treatment lasted until the Ming Dynasty in 1368, who established paper money and banned the use of silver coins. Following the collapse of the Ming and the replacement by the Qing Dynasty, silver coins were reintroduced primarily as a medium of exchange, with European colonial powers trading in the area. Trade of China evolved into a one-sided transaction where the people of China believed they were self-sufficient in all aspects and therefore were only incentivized to trade with Europeans if they could provide more silver. In 1792, the newly formed United States passed the Coinage Act, which established a federal mint in the US dollar, a piece of paper money directly tied to the gold and silver reserves of the federal government, creating the policy of bimetallism. While the US had initially founded a central bank in 1791 by Alexander Hamilton, who in a compromise with many lawmakers being opposed to a central bank, created it with a 20-year charter that must be renewed by Congress, which they failed to do so in 1811. The next 5 years saw general economic chaos as runaway inflation battered the economy because of the War of 1812. President James Madison was able to sign the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. When Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, he denounced the central bank and refused to renew its charter again, letting it expire in 1837, beginning a time called the Free Banking Era, where the U.S. had no central bank. During this period, private local banks took over the responsibilities of a central bank, something that proved to be impossible without major consolidation amongst the banks, which ultimately led to 50% of all banks founded during this period to go bust within 5 years. The National Banking Act of 1863 established a system of national banks to provide loans to fund the Union during the Civil War. The national banks, while not a real central bank, had additional lending requirements and regulations which caused their deposits to be deemed a higher quality, eventually causing the deposits to be hoarded and unfit for commerce. It was during this decade that countries around the world began to institute their own central banks, modeled off the now defunct American Bank. It was becoming increasingly clear that the solution to runaway inflation for a silver or gold coin was not to reprioritize which metals were to be used in commerce or which one commanded a higher value, but for the government to use its central bank to restrict the total supply of money in the system. The Coinage Act of 1873 officially embraced the gold standard and demonetized silver to retain the value of American coinage. The demonetization of silver caused outrage amongst the now decimated silver mining industry, and by 1878, extreme lobbying by the industry caused the passage of the Bland-Allison Act, which required the U.S. government to purchase a set amount of domestic silver annually. The conflict between whether silver or gold should be the rightful backer of the U.S. dollar continued for the rest of the 1800s, reaching a peak in 1896 when William Jennings Bryan earned the Democratic nomination for president and ran on a so-called free silver platform, which hoped to remove gold as a standard, an act that would greatly increase inflation, but also possibly redistribute wealth amongst individuals who did not have access to gold. The reasoning behind this push were dubious, and thankfully the free silver movement stalled and America remained on the gold standard for that time. The absence of an American central bank caused the money supply to rest in the hands of lending banks. So during the times of economic recession, any run on the bank by depositors caused immense shortages of money and compounded the pain of the downturn. By 1907, the United States was the only major economy to not have a central bank and was thus seen as extra risky. A stock market crash that year precipitated on this scandal and overvaluation of the United Copper Company caused prices to fall 50%. Liquidity of the private banks was further tested by the San Francisco earthquake that occurred earlier that year, which required large amounts of money to be transported from New York banks to the West Coast for reconstruction. Because of the lack of a central bank, the U.S. government had no way to influence money supply and had no way of containing the crash and ensuing liquidity crises. Thankfully, wealthy banker J.P. Morgan assembled an emergency team of other New York financiers to come up with the money themselves and avert the bankruptcy of many large institutions that could have wiped out the U.S. financial industry. The severity of the crisis convinced the government to finally create the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, which would oversee the money supply to soften the effects of economic downturns that had been so common since the Civil War. Following the stock market crash of 1929, President Franklin Roosevelt had to come up with a way to grow the economy and increase wages, but was limited in capacity due to the strict adherence to the gold standard. In response, FDR raised the exchange price of gold from $20 an ounce to $30 an ounce, which not only greatly increased the value of the existing money supply, but also saw huge influxes of foreign gold from economies like England and France, who themselves had suspended their own gold standards in an effort to address their own liquidity crises caused by the Great Depression. The U.S. received so much gold, in fact, that in 1936 they commissioned the construction of the National Bullion Deposit at Fort Knox. While the Chinese obsession with silver allowed them to weather the Great Depression largely unscathed, increased pressures for silver to be bought and sold in America due to laws passed requiring additional purchases of silver by the U.S. government ultimately limited the silver supply in China and forced them to adopt paper money once again. Following World War II, America held over half of the world's gold reserves and was positioned to help decide how a new system of value backed by gold would operate. 44 countries convened in New Hampshire to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement, in which all gold could be redeemed at $35 an ounce with the U.S. government. The system initially worked well as the economies of Europe and Asia, who had been decimated by the war, required goods purchased from the U.S., with the Bretton Woods system making this facilitation easier. By 1966, however, the U.S. no longer controlled the majority of the global gold supply, and the safety of the ability to exchange gold for U.S. dollars began to become suspect. The U.S. government began printing more and more money to pay for the war raging in Vietnam, causing the value of the dollar to fall. In 1971, West Germany left the Bretton Woods Agreement, unwilling to let the Deutschmark be further devalued by the dollar. Quickly, many other countries such as Switzerland and France began to demand their U.S. dollars be exchanged for gold with the desire to leave the agreement. President Richard Nixon, knowing there was an unsolvable crisis facing the U.S. if it remained true to the gold standard and the promise of exchangeability, canceled the convertibility of U.S. dollars into gold, effectively ending the gold standard in the U.S. and the rest of the world. In its wake, a system of freely floating fiat currencies were established where each country would maintain their own fiat currency, that is paper money, not backed up by the value of a commodity. And each currency would in turn be exchangeable with other currencies based on an exchange rate, which can fluctuate with the supply and demand of the currencies being bought and sold. Today, gold and silver act as a counter to inflation and the US dollar, and is seen in times as a safe investment.